Hi everyone, let's continuing discussing the London system. We'll look at this one from the point of view of white, and we're going to learn some positional ideas and some tactical ideas that can arise. So let's say we play d4, d5, bishop to f4 to enter the London. Now there are a lot of games in the database that arrive at the following position, which we can consider the main line. Knight f6, knight f3, c5, e3, knight c6, knight bd2, e6, c3, and white's getting closer to achieving that ideal setup for his minor pieces. He wants to get that bishop to d3. And you can arrive here with different move orders, but black often plays bishop d6, challenging our bishop, and we've seen this in an earlier video in the series. What white should do here is retreat the bishop, with the idea that if black captures, then white can open up the h-file for the rook. So a lot of players have instead castled, and then bishop d3. And now I want to talk about a positional idea for black. In order to equalize, what black would like to do is push the e-pawn forward to e5 to release the light squared bishop and to confront white's center. And a good rule of thumb is if black can get in that move e5, then black probably either has equalized or even has a slight edge. So white should stop black from making that move. Now black can't make that move now because white has that square covered 3 times and black only has it covered twice. But black can attempt to push that pawn by either playing queen to e7 to support it or rook to e8 to support it. And let's look at both moves. Let's start with queen to e7. Well, if black is about to push the pawn to e5, you should stop it. For example, if you make a lazy move here like castles, then that just allows e5 to be pushed, and black is already doing quite well. Black has the better center. He no longer has a problem light squared bishop, and I would prefer black. So for example, we'll continue, maybe a bunch of exchanges take place on e5, and white can gain a tempo on the queen and drive it back. But if you have a look, black has more space thanks to this nice pawn duo here, and black has no trouble with this development at all. So the engine says this is negative 0.3. Okay, so castling would not work in that position. So if black threatens to push that e-pawn forward, a good way to stop that is knight to e5. You want to blockade it with your knight. Now from here, a lot of games have continued with knight to d7, challenging the knight on e5. And white can exchange knights here, and then exchange dark squared bishops, and draw the queen forward to the c5 square. That all looked practically forced, didn't it? That sequence white made. Takes isn't the natural recapture with the bishop, and then takes, black recaptures with the queen, and then takes and black recaptures again. That all looked pretty forced. Well, if you look at the engine, it says the position is plus 2.2. White's actually winning, and it's thanks to a really surprising and interesting tactic. And it begins with the sacrifice bishop takes h7 check. And this reminds me of the Greek gift sacrifice, but the Greek gift sacrifice usually occurs when this knight is on f3. And the idea is if black captures the bishop, the knight goes to g5 with a check, and if the king returns to g8, then the queen comes to h5 and threatens a mate on h7. So the Greek gift sacrifice. But how could it possibly work with this knight all the way back on d2? Well, here's how. If black takes the bishop, then queen comes with check, forcing the king back. And here's how the knight gets into the game in a hurry, with the surprising move knight to e4. So that pawn is pinned. It can't take the knight because the queen would drop. So white gets a tempo on the black queen on his way to the g5 square to make a mate on h7. So what should black do here? Well, I looked at the database on Lichess, And I found out that there were 17 games in the master database, some played by grandmasters, where black had trouble here and lost. Okay, and here's the problem. One player tried a counterattack. Instead of moving the queen, one player tried g6, attacking the queen. But that didn't work because white took the queen, forcing black to recapture, and then white regained the piece here on d7. So white's not even down a piece after that bishop sacrifice. Not only that, but white's threatening the rook, and white's threatening to bring the knight to f6, calling check and picking up another pawn. And the game proceeded rook f, c8, knight to f6 check, king moved over, white took the pawn. And white easily won the game. White's up 2 pawns in the position. All right, so that counterattack g6 didn't work. So a bunch of other players tried queen to c4, just moving the queen out of the way. And then white followed through with their idea of bringing the knight to g5, threatening a mate on h7. And I wanted to point out that queen to d3 looks like it protects the mate, but it doesn't because there's e4 interfering with the protection. So instead of that move, a lot of players tried moving the rook out of the way. I shouldn't say a lot, there weren't more than a couple handfuls of games in the database here. But that does give breathing room to the black king, but you can see white has a really good attack for the sacrificed bishop. White can take on f7. And now you could continue your attack here with check, forcing the king over, check on h8, forcing the king over, and take that pawn and continue to attack. But there's a really nice engine move in the position, which is rook to d1. Beautiful, quiet move in the middle of the attack. And you'll see the point of it in a minute. So a sample line is maybe bishop to e8, attacking the white queen, but then check, drives the king over, check, drives it over again, check, and now the king's forced to the d file, and now we can see the power of the rook on d1. All right, and now another beautiful move, b3, trying to drive the queen away. For example, if the queen goes here, then there's a beautiful checkmate right in the middle of the board. That's a mate right there. It's a great move. Okay, so the black queen would have to stay in contact with that e4 square to prevent the mate, but there's very few places it could go. For example, queen h4, well, you can just attack the queen again. Queen g4, you can attack it again, and now the queen has nowhere to go to stay in contact with that square. So it has to give itself up somehow, like take the knight or something, in order to stop that potential mate. Okay, besides f3, you could also try this, check, and then get a discovered attack and win the queen that way. All right, so beautiful, beautiful attack possible that's very similar to that Greek gift. Okay, and it all looked kind of forced from a very innocent position here. Okay, right here, after white blockaded the pawn on e5, black tried retreating the knight to d7 to attack that knight. Can this really be a winning position for white? Well, it turns out no. After white captured the knight on d7, there's a better move for black. Black should take the knight with the queen instead of the bishop. Do you see what the difference is? If you think back through the lines we just played through, you might see the difference. I don't blame you if you don't see it. We just went through a lot of moves. But let's find out what the difference is. Let's say white tries the same thing. Trades off the dark squared bishops, takes on c5, and draws the queen forward. And then this Greek gift-like sacrifice on h7, check, drive the king back, knight to e4 thanks to the pinned pawn. Okay, trying to gain a tempo on the queen to get to the g5 square in a hurry. Well, in this position, there's a difference. The bishop is still on c8. The last time we got to this similar position, it was on d7. So that means now the move g6 does work. This counterattacking move works because if white takes the queen, black can take the queen, and white can't regain the piece. There's no bishop on d7 anymore. Black's just up a piece. But if you're white and you're in this position and black plays g6, don't panic. There's a way to bail out with a draw. You can't get any more than a draw, though. There's a draw by perpetual check. You start with queen to g5, you save your queen, and you're still attacking black's queen, so it has to move somewhere. It doesn't really matter where it moves. Let's say it goes to c4. And then there's knight to f6 check. That forces the king to g7 because king to h8 is an immediate checkmate. So king to g7, but then knight to h5 check. And this forces the king back to g8 because if it goes to the h file, let's say it goes to h8, then there's a queen check here followed by a mate on g7 if the king goes back there. If the king goes over here, we can just go back with our knight and call check. So there is a perpetual here, just like that. Okay. So the saving idea for black was to take back on d7 with the queen rather than the bishop. Okay, so really nice stuff. Okay, so I wanted to back up to the position right here after white played bishop to d3. So we just looked at the move queen to e7 to try to force this pawn forward to e5. But let's look at another move. What about rook to e8 to force the pawn forward? Well, again, white has to blockade that with the knight. Okay. Then black can trade here on e5. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and then knight d7. So there's an attack on the e5 pawn here. Now you might protect it with knight f3. That looks pretty natural. But another possibility is to play f4. Okay, I think that's a solid move as well. And black has a way to win a pawn here, and a good player would see this. Black can push to c4, drive the bishop back to, let's say, c2, and then bring the queen out and fork these two pawns. And white can't save them both. However, I think white is still doing well in the position after castling. And let's look at both pawn captures. If queen takes b2, then we can play rook c1. Now, the queen can take the a2 pawn, but the queen can't take c3 because bishop takes h7 check reveals an attack on the queen. But even if black takes that a2 pawn, white has a really good kingside attack brewing in the position. You have moves like f5, the queen can come over, h7 looks sensitive. You can push this pawn to e4, the knight can get into the attack. And this bishop looks pretty bad on c8. It's well out of the game, behind the light squared pawn chain. That rook is out of the action. The queen is offsides. The queen has spent some tempi over there collecting up pawns. So it's a fun position to play for white. All right, let's go back and look at the other pawn capture after castles. What if black takes this pawn? Well, just slide your king over to h1, and then maybe b5, and eventually you're going to drive the black queen out of your territory. And then you're going to play knight f3, and you're going to again have a good attack on the king side. So you've got a bishop pointing over there, you've got this move f5 coming, knight to g5, queen to h5, and again that bishop looks pretty bad behind all those pawns. So I think it's worth sacrificing the pawn, and I learned this whole line and all the ideas in this video from Grandmaster Aman Hambleton. I'll put a link to the video I learned from in the description below. But even if we don't follow these exact lines, I think we learned something positional about black trying to push the pawn to e5 and white stopping it with knight to e5. Okay, so I learned something. I hope you did too. Thanks for watching.